All right. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Dan Rydell.
I'm Colby Kresge.
I'm Matt Ciccone.
And I'm Jack Sipperly.
And we are Restoration Radio. Oh man, we got a special episode this week, as this one has been in the works for quite some time.
Over the last 30 episodes, we've researched and dove into a variety of restoration efforts worldwide. But now we finally get to focus on something a little closer to home, and just how these projects can help shape a new perspective to aquatic-based restorations.
Today we are talking about Oyster Reef restorations, and with us we have special guests Austin Humphries, Melissa Hayden, and Dave Sipperly.
What areas do you think are best to focus on implementing a reef restoration project, and what are some limitations of that as well?
Yeah, so there are a handful of things oysters are good at. They're really good at filtering water. So what that means is they can clean up the water column, and a lot of the things, the zooplankton and things they eat, help to improve the water clarity in places, right? Which allows sunlight to penetrate deeper in the water column, which can improve seagrass habitat. And so there's this cascading effect of oysters improving the water quality. They can also uptake nitrogen and carbon and store it in their muscle tissue or in their shell. So they're able to provide that sort of biogeochemical aspect or benefit for the ecosystem. They're good at building on one another. So they like to settle when they're little babies and larvae swimming in the water column. The currents are moving them, but they preferentially like to settle on themselves or on hard substrate. So what that means is that they build upon themselves to create these reefs, these aggregate kind of shell reefs. And so what that does is that creates a strong barrier for buffering wave energies. So they're good at buffering wave energies where they are three-dimensional reefs. They're in that same capacity. That creates all these little spaces and complex like habitat where little crabs and shrimp and fish are able to hide and reproduce. It creates this feeding ground at the same time for larger fish and crabs and things. So it has that sort of benefit to associated organisms as well. The second part of your question, where we should be focusing efforts. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the objective of the project. So if it's to, let's take the Narrow River, for example. One of the things you mentioned, Jack, was the boat wakes. There's a lot of boat traffic. And so erosion is an issue. And so if that's sort of objective number one, then you'd want to look at places that that have the most erosion problems and look to restore oyster reefs there. I mean, oyster reefs are not good at buffering high energy waves, whereas that might not be as important if you're thinking about the Providence River in Narragansett Bay up in the North Upper Bay, where objective number one there might be to clean up the water quality, to use oysters as a biofilter, if you will, for the rest of the bay. So there you can imagine restoring reefs and not prioritizing three-dimensional reefs, but a lot of oysters out there, and maybe you spread a lot of shell over a wide area.
And after reading your paper again, we got to thinking, and I was kind of like wondering why it's important to understand the local context of a restoration project.
Improving your chances of success really hinge on local environmental conditions, right? Knowing if the water that you're working in, the salinity changes drastically, let's say, because there's rivers coming in, and during rainy season or during times of high rainfall, that water becomes a lot fresher, and so the salinity drops. knowing that context will help you to know if it's a good place for oyster restoration, or
Cool.
how much to put effort to put there. Maybe it's like cut your losses in a place like that and focus more in another area. So knowing the local environmental context helps you with improving your chances of it working, like ecologically. And then I think the local context matters for the economic and cultural piece and the social acceptability piece, because a lot of oyster restoration projects rely on volunteers, or like weekend programs or voluntary shell recycling programs. And knowing knowing places where that is desired, or acceptable, or something of interest to local restaurants, to local citizens, is important.
Just going right into another question based off of your paper. Can you speak on the concept that reefs provide ecosystem services that can be estimated by like a monetary value? Because I know in the paper you talked about, like, for instance, reefs can provide services valued between 5,500 and 99,000 per hectare per year. I think that's like important to talk about from an economic kind of standpoint.
A rationale for that is if monetary value is placed on these sometimes unseen, underappreciated things that nature does, it will help increase the awareness or protection of such things. Sort of, if we know how important they are, we will protect it if it's in our best interest. Valuing nature, I guess, and valuing what oyster reefs can provide us does give us a sense, though, of how valuable they are, how much money we should spend on them or could spend on them, and what kind of returns we could expect.
I feel like in a way it can help justify restoration to people who aren't scientists. I think that's important for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And that's in large part one of the big points of valuing nature in this way, the ecosystem service valuation. It's to validate some of the efforts and money spent.
So another thing that we found really intriguing in your presentation was the idea of the attraction theory. And we've kind of been pondering as to how this would apply to the Narrow River, being a stretch of river that's fed by several streams coming into the central location. So we were wondering your take on the attraction theory in a location like this, and how it could serve as being more important, less important to the overall functionality of an oyster reef in the Narrow River.
The main point is whether habitat is limiting in that system or not. If it's not limiting in the sense that more organisms would thrive if habitat were created, it's going to be an attraction thing. But if habitat is limited in that system, where if you add salt marsh or you add something, more organisms will be produced. So comparing them through time, before and after, with experiments is really the only way you can like begin to understand whether you're just attracting more organisms from the other things or you're producing more.
You could kind of argue that if the oyster reef were to just be attracting organisms as opposed to manifesting them, then they're likely taking away from other habitats that they were serving a function in previously.
Right, exactly. And so what meets the eye at first may not be all roses, you know. There could be some negative impacts from other habitats, you know. Maybe these crabs that have moved from the salt marsh to the oyster reef were really important for the salt marsh for aerating the soil, right? And now you're losing that. Or the oyster reef attracted or attracted all these large fish that are now, they see this salt marsh right next to it and they're like, ooh, let me go eat some stuff over there now. So there's all these habitat connectivity types of things, and measuring impacts of restoration is difficult.
So what do you think are some of the largest sources of resistance that you've found through your restoration projects?
The cost
Definitely.
is probably number one. It's not cheap to do it on a large scale. The uncertainty in whether it will succeed or fail, just the unfamiliarity with it generally. People like ourselves on this call in our late teens or early 20s and mid to late 30s, we weren't alive during the heyday of oyster fisheries, and so oysters aren't as prevalent perhaps in our growing up and of our culture, and so that unfamiliarity and that cultural disjunct there, I think also provides a sort of like, what is this? Okay, I sort of answered your question. The two main things are the cost and the perceived risk on success.
Definitely.
Given whatever your objective is, if it's shoreline erosion, if it's habitat for fish, if it's water quality.
Cool.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, kind of moving on to our final question here, do you see, trends regarding an increase in oyster reef restoration projects along coastal zones? And, are these projects becoming, more useful, but also, more common, whether it's in the United States or globally?
I think so. I mean, I think as the last 20 years of science has started to build a consensus on what we know oyster reefs can do, it has proven to raise awareness and increased efforts for oyster reef restoration, including oysters in larger conversations about sea level rise and coastal erosion and buffering those, about habitat loss and fish and fisheries impacts, about water quality types of things. I think oysters weren't in that conversation so much 30, 40 years ago, and I think they are back in those conversations as not the silver bullet, but a tool we have to, maybe be implemented as our approach to tackling this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that.
So I'm Melissa Hayden. I am a district conservationist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. So I've been working for NRCS since 2004. I got a bachelor's from URI in Environmental Science and Management, and then went on to UVM and I studied soil chemistry while I was there for a master's degree. And pretty much started working for NRCS right out of grad school for the most part. And I started in Massachusetts and then moved to Rhode Island in 2010. So I've been working on the oyster restoration stuff since 2016.
How long has Rhode Island been doing oyster reef restorations, and what was the catalyst behind beginning all of these projects?
We started at NRCS, we started doing oyster restoration stuff in 2008. We had an initiative that we started where we're working with growers to basically grow out spat on shell and build oyster reefs with that material, and we paid them to do that. So that started in 2008. Prior to that, I don't think NRCS had done any work with oyster growers in Rhode Island. And so that initiative took us through probably 2013, I would say. We didn't do any of these projects for a couple of years. That was due to our national office saying, hold on, oysters are livestock. You can't buy livestock and use it for restoration. And then 2 years later in 2015, we were able to make the case again that no, this isn't livestock that we're purchasing. We are doing this work for habitat restoration. and water quality purposes. And they said, okay, now we understand, you can start again. So 2015 through the present, we've been doing this stuff. So at least for NRCS since 2008. And, you know, we started because we felt like the oyster reefs that we could build with growers would have pretty significant ecological benefits. And it was a way that also NRCS could spend some of our dollars that we get. So we get a certain amount of money every year, and we have to spend that money or it goes back to the national office. It doesn't come to Rhode Island, and we want to be able to use it for Rhode Island farmers.
So kind of moving on here, do you know how many total acres of reefs have been created so far? And then also, are there any plans to further expand and grow this number in, you know, the following years?
And we absolutely are looking to expand. And so we recently worked on a partnership agreement with DEM, where we're going to work with them on developing a longer term restoration plan for aquaculture for shellfish. And so that will identify additional sites in the future where we can do this work. And so we will use that plan to continue to be able to fund these projects.
So like, what is the current success rate of some of these restorations? And like, what do most people deem as successful?
We do, as part of our projects, we do monitoring on all of these reefs. We pay the growers that deployed the material to actually hire a contractor to go out and monitor. So we are doing follow-up to see how successful they have been. And it really depends, it's really location dependent. So there are some spots, for example, in Potter Pond, where a lot of the oysters have died, unfortunately, the ones that we put out there. And there are other areas where things have done really well. The reefs are living, are thriving, they're reproducing, they're growing. So I think it has overall been very successful. There are just a few spots where the survivability has not been fantastic.
Cool. Is the best way to mitigate some of these like failures? Like what would be the best way to mitigate some of that?
If we're assuming that in some of these spots the issue is disease prevalence, there unfortunately is not a lot we can do. There's disease that is there, and it's probably not going to go anywhere. And so what we do is we would move our project, maybe in the same biosecurity zone where we can still do the work, but just kind of try it somewhere else.
What role have oysters played as a native species in Rhode Island, both ecologically, economically, and socially?
So I think that a lot of the growers that we work with have been doing this for their whole lives, and maybe their fathers did the same thing. And so that native oyster population that used to be thriving in Rhode Island was a huge economic stimulator. Obviously, oysters and sort of the sale of oysters to restaurants and the markets is a huge economic sort of thing in Rhode Island. There are a lot of oysters, like maybe 50 oyster farms in Rhode Island. And I think that industry is growing. There's a huge demand for it. And so we're trying to help with the economic viability of these businesses. And I think from an ecological perspective, they have a huge capacity to filter water. So what they do for water quality is pretty incredible. And then the habitat they provide. So if you think about an oyster reef and all of the sort of voids and spaces that provide habitat and cover for aquatic organisms and finfish, there's a huge benefit there, as well as the oysters themselves are a food source for other things like maybe migratory birds or other aquatic wildlife. They're gonna eat these things that are pretty high in protein. The protection of our shoreline from erosion, from wave action. I think part of the reason that our program is so successful and so sort of desirable for these growers is that it provides sort of a known income in a given year. So we have this money set aside for them, and they know if they seed their shell in the spring and grow out that spat-on shell over the course of the summer, they have a built-in payment coming to them in the fall. And so, especially in a year like this, where the restaurant market was severely depressed due to COVID, I, heard from a lot of growers that this program really helped them help keep the farm alive this year, because this was something that they knew they were going to have, a payment they were going to have in the fall.
So, I mean, you definitely mentioned the global pandemic as a setback to the program, but given normal circumstances, are there any other concerns that you guys face, whether it be annually or daily?
There are environmental factors, obviously, that they cannot control. So in any type of farming, weather can play a huge role. So if we had a hurricane, they could have their entire crop for that year wiped out. So there's some risk, obviously, in farming and in any type of aquaculture, because you are at the mercy of Mother Nature to some extent. So from our program perspective, we've been pretty level funded under the Farm Bill, and so we've been consistently getting, a certain amount of money every year, which has been enough to fund a lot of the folks that have applied. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and that has helped them, I think, in these years where there have been these other unforeseen circumstances that have been issues for them.
Based on what you said before about certain individuals kind of viewing oysters as primarily a livestock organism, so to speak, I'm sure that there are other people who would also disagree with using them for conservation and restoration purposes. So when you're faced with that demographic of people, what is like your main method of convincing them and stakeholders and just the public to support the Oyster Reef restoration projects?
I think for us, it's mostly, we try to come at that from like an education perspective. I think when folks are opposed to something, it's sometimes because they just don't realize the benefits. They don't have all the information. So all we can really do from our perspective is to point out all of the benefits that this work is providing. So the ecological benefits, the water quality benefits, and certainly I think when folks have that information, they're more inclined to be agreeable to something like this. Silly things like folks don't want to see people out working on the water. It ruins their view, which is so crazy to me, but we've heard that, and I think some people you're never going to convince.
Yeah, it definitely makes me think that just with a little bit of education about the oysters themselves and also how you can integrate them into a ecosystem just really shows that they're a very beneficial species. Yeah, so do you think like on a more, I guess, local, national, or even global scale that oyster reef restoration could be used in like a very significant manner, or do you think they can only really be used in specific instances?
Folks are doing oyster restoration in different ways depending on their location. So I think here in Rhode Island, it's a relatively small scale that we're doing these projects on, whereas in New Hampshire, they will dump shell and oysters off of really big barges out in the bays, and it's just a whole different scale. And so I think depending on the location, you can kind of scale the project for what's appropriate for that spot. I think these projects are a win-win. They benefit the environment. There are people that want to fund them, like NRCS, and they benefit the growers because they give the growers sort of another source of income, an additional way to supplement their income from the farm. So I think that these could be used on a much larger scale.
And I think to add to that too, do you notice, any trends as of recent, and maybe even some projections as to, a growth and increase in, reef area, along coastal zones? Like, is this something that, within, 5, 10, 15, 20 years that we think could really, really grow and could be useful? Yes, like obviously on a local scale, state scale, national scale, and especially how you mentioned that, depending on the actual area of interest, that you can scale the project and tailor it to that area.
Yeah, I do think that there's a lot of potential, and I think I'm seeing it growing, even just through my NRCS work. We were contacted, for example, a year ago by this NRCS state office in Texas who wanted to come to Rhode Island and see how we're doing this program so they could implement something like this in Texas. And I just yesterday had a woman from New Jersey come up and spend the day on the boat with us to see how we're implementing things, because she's trying to get something started in Jersey. So there are examples like that all the time of people wanting to do more work like this, wanting to start these initiatives in their states.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can kind of speak on a personal aspect on that, and work with my dad over the last 4 or 5 years on all the projects that he's been involved in, and it's amazing. And being able to have obviously the opportunity, but like you said with the funding, I mean, there's been years, obviously, markets aren't always at, peak optimal levels, especially this year, as we know, but, having that extra funding and then having, the ability to then grow the business, having the extra money to, buy another boat, buy another motor, buy another truck. And then, as you expand, the effects on the environment, obviously, now that you're able to, grow more oysters, grow more, and just increase everything. I think, from a economic and environmental standpoint, I mean, these projects are so helpful to us.
First couple of questions I have for you are just, how did you get involved in reef restoration projects? Like, did somebody reach out to you? How was the application process? What position and stuff did you strive for? Stuff like that.
I studied marine fisheries and aquaculture at University of Rhode Island many years ago. Worked at the original oyster farm, the first and the founding company in Rhode Island that was operated by Robert Rowe, Skid as we call him, and it was called Spatco. And so I always dabbled with the shell fishing, and I'm a diver. In Quanticottag, we did a site for a reef, and we grew oysters for them. We did the dumps, and the reef today is thriving and doing extremely well. So what it meant to me was, it was basically like the WPA. It was a government-funded work program, right, where they're getting what they need because they don't have the labor, the resources, or the space or the expertise to grow oysters for the restoration grant. I did it for them. They paid me to do so. And doing so, that federal money really, instead of just getting nothing for it, went to, okay, I gave them product, we dumped it, and in return, I used that money to buy boats, buy seed, invest in gear. All local businesses benefited from the money that they paid me for doing the work. So, and we made a little bit of profit. So that all went right back into the farm, which again went right back into the local community. So think about it. It's like it's a modern day version of the WPA, but instead of making trails and so forth, we're making reefs. And those reefs are super valuable because they protect the shoreline, they provide habitat for juvenile fish, and most of those fish are commercially important species like tautog and black sea bass and scup. In places where we've done oyster reefs, we've seen seahorses, so that means the water quality has been exceptional and really good. But you can go to places where there's no oysters, not even an inch of oysters, just mud, and you see nothing there except an occasional crab. And then we start throwing down a layer of oysters, even if it's just 1 inch high. And then you start seeing everything else. You see the ecosystem just blossom, everything from crabs and lobsters and blue crabs to juvenile fish, tropical fish such as big eyes, spotfin butterflies, snowy groupers. I mean, it's amazing what a little bit of relief can do to the ecosystem.
Could you describe like the reef building process from a grower's viewpoint?
Yeah, it takes planning. It definitely takes planning, because the first thing you got to do is you've got to acquire clean shell, and oyster shells work the best. If you can't get oyster shell, then you can source surf plant. That's the next best. But we're looking for good clean shell that's been either comes from a shellfish plant that steam shucks their clams. So now they're already sterilized. And if not, then you're going to have to acquire shell from places and then show proof that you met the biosecurity guidelines of rotating, drying, cleaning, and making sure the shell's clean. So there are some guidelines that the NRCS and DEM follows for that shell. You get the shell, you put them in spat bags. And that's important because we're going to use those spat bags to transport the oysters. So the spat bags typically go into a spawning tank, which you just think of a large swimming pool. They fill it up with seawater. They bring it to the right temperature. And then at some point in time when all the bags are in there, they'll take eye larvae. And eye larvae, literally, you could have 12 million baby eye larvae oysters in a cup this big that maybe fill up about an inch. So we pour the eye larvae into the swimming pool. Of course, there's aeration and a little bit of flow and bubbles around there. And the larvae float around for a couple of days, and then they settle on the spat bags. So those spat bags are important because all those little nooks and crannies, the oysters are going to go and settle into the bags, into the shells. So oyster shell's better. Surf clam is better because there's volume there and there's nooks and crannies. But when you get crushed shell that's all busted up and heavy, then everything's compressed and there's no space for the oysters to settle in and do their thing. So we keep them in the swimming pool for about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on the time of year and the temperature. And once we start seeing little eye larvae on the shell, they look like little brown dots. We take the oysters out of the bag, transport them to the farm. And this, we do it on our side, our lease. And we put them in cages, drop the cages down, and we leave them for almost about a month. And now they're just filter feeding water. They're doing their own natural thing. And in about a month, then they're about maybe a pea-sized shape, maybe a quarter of an inch, depending on how they're growing. And then about 6 weeks, 8 weeks total, we rip open the bags, put them in trays. So now we've exposed everything. They get more flow, more ceston flux, and that's going to be water flowing through them, carrying the plankton, which is their food. And then they grow, and they stay there till they're at least a 1 inch in size.
That's awesome to hear about.
So it's a lot of labor. You're taking 200 bags of shell. You got to stuff them. You got to put them in a swimming pool. You got to take them onto a small boat to your site. Then you got to bring up all the oysters into a small boat, bring them back in. Then you got to dump them on the dump site. So it's a lot of physical labor with a lot of small boats, and these are all done in coastal ponds. So if you could do a bigger section like Narragansett Bay or Gardiner's Bay or something in Long Island where you got deeper water, you could get bigger boats in, you could do everything in big mounds and hoses and getting stuff pushed off barges rather than small boats that are operating in sometimes 1 feet, 3 feet, 6 feet of water.
Oh, it's a complex process, but it seems very well organized and very chronological in its steps.
It's all about preparation.
And do you think that these measures could be taken on like a global scale, both like economically and ecologically for other degraded ecosystems, whether oysters are native or maybe they would even become an invasive?
The answer is yes, as long as you could find people willing to do the hatchery work. That seems to be the bottleneck.
What kind of trends have you seen like in the past 5 or 10 years compared to when oyster reef restoration begun in terms of people using oysters as a restoration process, and like what goals have you noticed sort of trending?
Well, I think 10 years ago, they were never thinking of restoring oysters for restoration process. I think they were more like looking at cement structures and structures to create habitat, right? Which works if you're attracting finfish and shellfish, not clams and oysters. So I think the fact that oysters can filter so much water, one oyster 50 gallons a day, which would clear sediments and plankton out of the water, allow sunlight to penetrate deeper, be better for eelgrass beds, still provide that structure for habitat for species, whether they're invertebrates or vertebrates. I think there's just more positive spin-offs using oysters because they're already the perfect organism. You know, in the 1800s, 90% of the Atlantic seaboard was covered in oysters and oyster reefs. And, you know, now the majority of them are gone or built upon, or they filled in, or they're just dead. The Caribbean have coral reefs, so we don't have coral reefs. We have oyster reefs, we have rock piles, and then we have eelgrass. Those are the substructures that support the shoreline, and those are the structures that support erosion and, of course, handle the impact from storms and other coastal issues.
So how do you think like we could take smaller scale reef projects and just kind of apply them to a more larger scale? And how do you think that could be done cost effectively?
You know, and I think it's proven that the smaller farms can grow this stuff better and faster than having it start up from scratch with using true federal dollars or government dollars starting from scratch, right? Use the infrastructure that's already in place. There is one thing that can actually limit the amount of aquaculture or this type of restoration, and that is, where do we store all the shell? Where do we store all the gear to grow this? Because when it's not in the water, it can be a little smelly and it can be an eyesore. So you also, and you can't store that kind of stuff on the waterfront because waterfront property is too expensive. So there almost needs to be an inland place that can be government owned, state owned, but the farmers have access to store their equipment and their gear there to keep all of this stuff. So I think that's the other thing that that would need to be looked at. That's probably often unlooked, because, you know, storing 50 cubic yards or 10,000 cubic yards of shell, that's like driving through Providence and seeing the big scrap building, right? Of recycled metal that's going on to freighters. But, you know, if that was the 1800s and early 1900s in Providence, those mounds, instead of scrap, were oyster shells.
Yeah, those are considerations I haven't really thought about. And that's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I think there's a lot more to it that meets the eye if you want to go that large scale, for sure.
Yeah, and then you need equipment too. You need bulldozers or backhoes or something to move that kind of shell. And you're not going to do that with totes, right? Totes are only used in small coastal areas with small boats for small reefs. But if you're going large, you're going to fill up a barge, and the barge is either going to open from the bottom, or you're going to hydrojet it off the barge deck with big water guns, you know, and broadcast that stuff over a big area. So it's all possible.
What do you think the next step is? Do you think there's more science needed to create like a more sustainable oyster reef like culture, or, you know what I mean? Do you think there's more science needed, or do people need more time?
I think the biggest question, like I said earlier, was, okay, let's look at these reefs 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. How are they doing? If they're dying, what's the cause of that? Is it disease? Is it predation? Is it icing? What is it? Give us some environmental data around those areas as well, salinity and water quality and all that sort of stuff. That could help maybe understand what's going on there. What I really want to know is, with the water currents, where's all the seed, their spawn going? And maybe, do we need more spawning oysters, or do we just need more suitable habitat for that to settle on? But before we just dump shell everywhere, well, where's the current going? Where's the spat going? And if we could determine that, that would be huge, right? Is it all just going out to sea and dying in the middle of the Atlantic, or is it going up the bay? I don't think we know enough about where that goes. I'll sum this up for us. It's a great opportunity for every farmer to get some seed money, grant money, to help their business grow. And I think every successful grower in Rhode Island has benefited from this program. So economically, it's a huge success, because those dollars went back into the local economy. So I think that is a good thing. You know, number one, economic growth and economic success. 2, environmental. Well, time will tell, but you're doing the right thing based on what oysters can provide in terms of the environment. And then I think 3, education. It has helped the awareness of everyone. And I think if we continue to educate, programs like this should always continue. But I think it's all about habitat restoration. And what's the number one reason why species go extinct? It's loss of habitat. So anything we can do to maintain the habitat, even in small areas, will always be beneficial to that local site.
I think over the course of at least the last 3 interviews that we've done, I mean, it is incredible how complex each little component of this reef restoration project is. Like
Yeah, and then you're looking at the perception of those people from their point of view. Now, I'm sure if you look at some fishermen and co-hoggers, they're going to say, yeah, I think it's great. Maybe you look at a house or a landowner now who's abutting a property looking down at a bunch of buoys for 2 years while the project's going on. They might have a different perception of it altogether. But I think you're right. It's a complex issue, and it's based on from your perspective of where you're at as whether you think it's a good thing or not. But I know from my point of view, 95% of the people I talk to think it's the right thing and a positive thing. And there are 5% of the people that just don't think it's either working or they just want it, but not in their backyard. They want it somewhere else.
That's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you right back here next week for episode 31.